Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those of you not joining us here on the West Coast. My name is Jennifer Bennett. I'm the Senior Manager of Education and Training here at Volunteer Match, and I want to welcome you to our Insight series on new tools and strategies for managing risk. Before I get started and introduce you to Mr. Ernie Allen, who's going to be our guest speaker today, I did just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. First of all of you are on an automatic mute this morning, so you don't need to worry about any background noise on your part. Just because we can't hear your voice doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. You should see a GoToWebinar toolbar in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You could open that up. You should find the questions tool, the word questions with either a plus sign or an arrow sign next to it. That's how you can chat into us today. We're going to be keeping track of some of those questions as well as having hopefully a lively discussion after we go over some of the information that we learned in our recent survey. We are also going to be live tweeting during today's session, so if you are on Twitter and want to participate there by either asking questions or joining in the conversation, you can do so using the hashtag VMLearn, like Volunteer Match Learn. And I believe that everyone will be getting an email afterwards with a link to the recording of the webinar as well as the slides. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Ernie Allen. Ernie Allen is the leading global expert on the issues of child abduction, sexual exploitation, sexual violence, and human trafficking. He's a frequent keynote speaker at major U.S. and international conferences and currently serves as a consultant to governments, corporations, and organizations on issues related to child protection, trafficking, public-private partnerships, the internet, and the digital economy. Mr. Allen founded and served as president and CEO of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. During his tenure, more than 180,000 missing children were recovered, and the recovery rate increased from 62% in 1990 to 97% in 2012. He established the National 24-Hour Missing Children Hotline, brought forensic resources including age progression and facial construction to law enforcement, and trained over 300,000 police and prosecutors. He created the National Cyber Tip Line for reporting sexual exploitation, the Child Victim Identification Program that analyzed millions of child pornography images to rescue child victims, and helped U.S. Marshals track 100,000 fugitive sex offenders. Globally, he built a missing children's network that included 23 nations, trained law enforcement in 121 countries, and worked with parliaments in 100 countries to enact new laws. He led efforts to implement new policies worldwide on virtual currencies and the anonymous deep web, and created and chaired a financial coalition which reduced commercial child pornography from a $30 billion industry to virtually zero. A technology coalition to address child victimization, and a global healthcare coalition to address child sexual exploitation as a public health crisis. Mr. Allen's work has been widely recognized, and he is the author of numerous articles and book chapters. Please help me welcome Mr. Ernie Allen. Hello, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Jennifer. I'm really grateful to you and Volunteer Match for the opportunity to talk about this timely and important issue.
Well, welcome, and I know I'm looking forward to our conversation, and I'm sure our audience is as well. Before we jump into that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the survey that we did, and maybe some of you listening maybe participated in that. We were really looking for some insight into how nonprofits screen their volunteers, not just sort of the background checks, but holistically. What are you doing to make sure that you're bringing those right volunteers into your organization and matching that right volunteer with the work in your organization? We had over 1,600 people complete our survey, which is really exciting. And excuse me, I want to just apologize now. I'm fighting a cold, so I'm going to do my best to not lose my voice. And so we did have quite good response on a wide variety of questions, including sort of the reasons behind some of the actions that we do to screen volunteers, those techniques, decision makers within your organization, that time and money associated with how often volunteers are screened, which volunteers are screened. I think we've got some interesting insight. I think there's some good information. A lot of you are doing some really great work on screening, but as almost always, there's some room for growth as well. We have some things to think about as we move forward, and I think that's hopefully where our discussion is going to go today. So we did get a wide variety of people coming in and taking that survey. You can see that we had quite a few people in the health and medicine, children and youth, and those volunteer organizations that were working with seniors, which I think makes a lot of sense. If we think about that, we know that those audiences are our most vulnerable populations. We want to make sure that we're protecting client confidentiality, that we're protecting the vulnerable populations that we serve. And we did get a good response from some of those decision makers, like our executive directors, volunteer coordinator, probably a most common title out there, but a good range of people participating as well. So I think when we get into the next few slides, we can see that there are some good information coming in from these questions about who's asking or who's answering these questions and how those decisions are being made within your organizations. Again, sort of how many volunteers were engaged by the organization, a good mix of those smaller grassroots organizations as well as those larger national or maybe even international organizations. So again, a nice little bell curve there, so we've got some good distribution. This is where we start to get into some of those meatier questions, and I think this is a nice chart to look at. We always use these techniques. So asking questions on applications, doing interviews, whether that's in person or using something like Skype or Google Hangouts or on the phone. Background checks, 46% coming in there with always doing background checks, and then falling off a little bit with reference checks and skills checks. So we can see that there are quite a few of these sort of holistic screening techniques that are being used by many of you always, which I think is a really interesting place to sort of start our conversation or to think about as we move into that, particularly when we look at those numbers compared with the same screening techniques with seldom or never. So while we are seeing good adoption on a lot of these, there are still so many organizations out there that aren't thinking about this, that aren't doing interviews, which Mr. Allen and I were chatting about before. Is really one of those things that really can get to the sort of the inner workings or motivations of your volunteers, and it's not a financial resource. So we'll talk more about that. Also looking at reference checks, again falling off on that, so there's a big group in the middle, about 60% that's not sort of sometimes doing reference checks, sometimes not, and that's another great way to get to know your volunteer outside of the work that they're doing and sort of outside of the information that they're providing to you. All right, so we want to get you guys involved too. We have some poll questions. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. And the question is, do you screen your volunteers less than you screen your employees? So if you have screening practices in place for your employees, are they different from or less rigorous than those that are for your volunteers? Are they less rigorous than you use for paid staff? So Mr. Allen, do you have anything that you wanted to talk about as far as this idea of having a sort of parallel track for screening paid staff as well as volunteer staff?
Well, Jennifer, absolutely. And I think the important thing in this approach is that every organization needs to view this as a need to build a volunteer management program. Screening alone is not enough. That needs to involve identification, screening, credentialing, verification of who the person is. From the Sure ID volunteer match survey that you conducted, a couple of numbers in addition to the ones that you reflected on the screen really jumped out at me. And while the numbers are better, the numbers are improving over earlier surveys I've seen, it is still a fact that more than 13% of volunteer organizations either never screen or rarely screen. Yeah. It is still a fact that 1 in 4 volunteer organizations still never do criminal history background checks. And of those who do, barely half, 51.3%, do national checks. There's still a lot of organizations that even doing criminal history background checks are only doing them locally or regionally. The other thing that jumped out at me from the survey is that nearly 65% of the organizations just do one-time checks. Mm-hmm. I had an opportunity a number of years ago to work with ABC's 2020, which was focusing on a school district in a state I won't name, that basically said, oh, we have a comprehensive system for doing background checks and screening of all of our employees and all of those who access children. But ABC found 20 employees who had criminal histories of sexual abuse against children who were working in that school district.
Wow.
The background check didn't find them because they were only screening them once.
Right.
So there needs to be an ongoing process. So my message today is, while I think enormous progress is being made, every organization needs to think about this in a more comprehensive way, in a more consistent way. 46.6% of the respondents to your survey indicated that they have no adopted organizational policy or procedure in place to deal with these issues. And that's just not enough. That's not adequate. We need policy. We need procedures. We need to train our people to utilize them. And so I really admire what Volunteer Match is doing in this area.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and share those poll results. And I think we can see that many of us in our organizations have some of those policies in place for paid staff. So that's always a great place to start, to look at what kinds of screenings you're doing with your employees or with paid staff that you bring into your organization, and evaluate that against the work that you're doing to screen or evaluate volunteers for your organization. Mr. Allen, do you have some other thoughts, and maybe from your experience, on how to start to think a little bit about increasing the way that you screen volunteers, or the sort of cohesiveness that you bring to screening anyone who comes into your organization in general?
Well, let me just, by way of background, let me mention, when I was running the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Congress in 2003 asked us to conduct a national background screening pilot for major youth-serving organizations. And we did that, and we did it for 8 years. And this was fingerprint-based. Every prospective volunteer was fingerprinted. Every one of them was told they were subject to a national criminal history background check through the FBI. And even knowing that, nearly 3% of the applicants were excluded because of their prior criminal history. We had people convicted of drug dealing, of rape, of sexual abuse against children. Sexual molesters applied to be volunteers for youth. We had a whole range of criminal activity. And the way these guys attempted to circumvent the process, to beat the process, was through providing wrong information. Yeah. Providing a wrong name, or a wrong social security number, or leaving out details. So to those in the volunteer business, particularly those who are servicing vulnerable populations like children and the elderly or the developmentally disabled or the infirmed, we should never be surprised that those who would prey upon those populations seek legitimate access to them. Their goal, I've spent 30 years trying to debunk the myth of the stranger. It is not strangers who are victimizing our vulnerable populations. It is people who become known to them, who have legitimacy with them. So it's really important that every volunteer-based organization be vigilant and build the kind of comprehensive systems and approaches that we need. You mentioned briefly just simple things like reference checks. The Sure ID survey found that only 33.7% of the organizations surveyed always do reference checks, and only 58% do in-person or phone interviews. We think you have to do reference checks. And the more you can engage with these people personally, the more you can draw them out. You can learn more about them. You can find out where their fixations are, what their interests are. And if they're providing reference material and leaving gaps. One of the things historically that nonprofit organizations have done, particularly youth-serving nonprofits, is when they apprehend people who are victimizing children, too many of them concerned about their own organizational liability have said, well, if you will go away quietly under cover of darkness, we won't press charges. Well, the reality is all that does is move them to somebody else's organization.
Right.
I talked to a board once of a youth-serving organization who said, you know, if we charge these guys, if we throw the book at them, it's going to make the public feel less confident about our organization. My argument is the very opposite is true. You want to send a message that your organization has a zero-tolerance policy regarding anybody who would come into your organization and do harm to whoever your clientele is. So we think organizations ought to be eager to stand up and make an example out of these people and send a message not only to the public, but to prospective volunteers who would come in.
Right, take much more of that. We are policing, we are monitoring, we are doing our due diligence as opposed to just brushing it under the rug and hoping your name doesn't end up in the papers.
Absolutely, and that's hard. I mean, we understand that organizations are concerned about their own PR, concerned about their own potential liability. I talked to a board once that said, if we do the things you're asking us to do, don't we increase our exposure in these cases? And my answer is, yes, if you just pay lip service.
Right.
You have to do it right. Background screening is not a panacea. There's no guarantee if you do national criminal history background checks that the guy you're screening for has been caught, has been convicted. But that's why the answer here is a comprehensive approach. Of course you screen. And of course you make sure that the person you're dealing with is who he says he is. And you develop a credentialing approach so that there is a validation, a verification of who he is. So the kinds of approaches that Volunteer Match has been exploring with Sure ID are exactly the kinds of approaches that every organization needs to take. You need to draft those policies. You need to develop criteria for who's going to be screened and who's going to make the determination about who's appropriate and who's not. You need to consult with your attorney regarding employees so you make sure you're not violating the Civil Rights Act or federal or state laws prohibiting workplace discrimination. You need to require applicants to sign a document to provide a permission form. But this is one step in a total system for volunteer management that I believe every organization, from the smallest to the largest, needs to address, needs to incorporate. It's the right thing to do for the population you're serving, and it's the right thing to do for your organization.
Great. I think that's an excellent transition to sort of our next poll and our next conversation around those criminal and background checks. I think Mr. Allen and I are in agreement that those are not the only thing that you should be doing, but they can certainly be illuminating. And I think you said over 3% of the people submitted background checks knowing that they had criminal history that was going to be unearthed, but they moved forward anyway because that seemed like an opportunity for them to continue in that behavior or access to those vulnerable populations. So in our survey, we did have 65.5% of our respondents say that they have run criminal or background checks on their volunteers, and almost 57% run criminal or background checks on all of their volunteers. So that's a good movement on the needle, a good chunk of those people who are screening all of their volunteers, and that it takes about 2 to 5 days, so about a working week at the maximum to get that information back. So we wanted to go ahead and ask you, are you currently or have you in the past run criminal background checks on your volunteers? So I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll. Take a minute to go ahead and vote, and while you're doing that, Mr. Allen, do you have, I know you've implemented quite a few of these policies, do you have thoughts on sort of best practices or things to think about when you integrate or incorporate criminal and background checks into your screening programs?
Well, I think there are a growing number of model approaches. For example, the Centers for Disease Control did a comprehensive report on this that provides, I think, excellent guidance. The work that EID Passport and their Sure ID initiative has done in developing a model that is comprehensive and uses the kinds of tools that minimize the risks. I think one of the messages I would deliver to many of the organizations that may be doing criminal history background checks now is we recognize that one of the hurdles is cost. And there are a lot of groups who are doing very inexpensive, $1, $2 background checks. My concern is a lot of those really don't have much value. So, I think the important thing is to do it. Again, from your survey with Sure ID, you found that just 37% of the people doing criminal history background checks only do local searches, county criminal searches. I had a colleague who worked with me many years ago who moved to another state. His wife became a school teacher in that school district. They did a background check. They only did a background check on the state in which she was applying for the job.
Right.
A state in which she never lived before. She didn't have time to build a criminal history in that state.
Right.
So, there's a common sense to this. And so I think it's important that organizations do it, recognizing it's not a panacea. But one of the things that's really important is that you have a system for verifying who this person is. That to whom you're providing access to your service population. So it is becoming, there are techniques that are available today that are much more affordable. There are offsets available for the cost. It's really important that that organizations do it properly.
Great, and we can see from the people listening in today that 78% are or have in the past run criminal or background checks. So I think, that's a good representation, even better than what we had in our survey as far as implementing that. And I do want to reiterate or join in that conversation. I like to use that term, Swiss cheese screening, if you're just running background checks but not looking at some of those other pieces like interviewing or reference checking. You've got big holes that people can pass right through for your screening process, because that background check, that criminal background check, is just going to catch those crimes that someone's been convicted of or charged with in the area that you're searching. So it's a good reminder. Oops. All right. So we asked about top types of checks, who you were, what kinds of databases or information you were looking for. So we've got some national criminal database search, which is going to Mr. Allen's point, don't just look in your region or in your state. You want to be looking nationally. The sex offender registry search, which is certainly a very important thing to be looking for if you are bringing volunteers into direct contact with vulnerable populations or with clients. And then that social security number validation and address history. Are volunteers who they say they are? Can you match that with information that they've given you? Does that verify who they say they are and what they've been doing and where they've been living? And again, to go to Mr. Allen's story, we want to make sure that if we are only checking regionally, that we look how long has our volunteer been in this area, been at this address. If they have a history of living somewhere else, probably a good idea to search that area as well, or to look at that national search. All right, so we're going to ask if you run national or state background checks, and and then maybe we'll open it up for some questions from the group. So Vicki is managing our back end. If you want to take a look at some of those questions and see if we've got something to get going for the conversation. So give people a few seconds to vote on this. I think the message that we've been talking about today is that national is probably the way to go. And I'm going to go ahead and give everybody just a couple more seconds to vote and then share this. And it looks like we are split pretty close to the middle there, 53% nationally and 47% specific state or locale. Mr. Allen, do you want to reiterate or add in anything else about that sort of need for national checking as opposed to looking just regionally or locally?
No, absolutely, and I think that's really a key point. We live in a time in which people are highly mobile, in which their obvious background, where they've lived, what they've done, may contain gaps. One of the points that we make as organizations do interviews for reference checks is try to do those reference checks verbally. Try to talk to the organizations or the companies with whom these people have been identified and look for the gaps. If someone has previously been a volunteer at 5 organizations and only provides references for 3, why? So probe that. And I know we live in a time in which a lot of companies and a lot of organizations are reluctant to be responsive, but you have to try harder and you have to find somebody who will talk to you. Because you want to be vigilant, you want to identify why someone left a particular organization when he did, particularly if he omits that from the list of references he provides. So national checks, I think in this day and age, are absolutely essential. And there are ways to do them today that are more affordable, and I think it is a basic level of protection that every organization needs to utilize.
I agree, and I wanted to just make another pitch for the volunteering references as well. I think they can be very illuminating and very eye-opening, particularly if you do those either on the phone or if you can with even a Skype or a Google Hangout to get a sense of who that volunteer was and what they contributed, particularly with, I like the situational questions. Instead of just asking, can you think of any reason why this volunteer shouldn't work with children, of course everyone's going to say no, right? Nobody wants to give a bad reference, and most of the time a volunteer is going to give you people who are, they're friendly with, who think that they're doing good work. But if you ask a question like, can you tell me about a time you saw the volunteer interacting with a child who was being difficult? How did they respond to that? What was the outcome? Would you have done anything differently? You start to get some more information, a little bit more illuminating information as to how that volunteer might potentially fit into your organization. All right. So we've talked about this a little bit already. We've certainly talked about those vulnerable populations, right? We want to make sure that we are protecting those clients or those people that interact with our organization who aren't necessarily able to protect themselves. We also want to make sure that we're protecting that confidential information, whether those are health records or access to client or donor information. In this day and age, it doesn't take much to to steal someone's identity or to use their credit card in an inappropriate manner. So we want to make sure that we're getting to know the volunteers that have access to that. It didn't show up in the top 3, but we also had answers of volunteers being responsible for cash and making sure that you're putting some of those screenings or background checks into place for the activities that volunteers are going to be doing that might open them up to temptation or might be a draw for those people who are looking to, take criminal action or take advantage of those populations we're working with. Mr. Allen, do you have any other thoughts on this or anything you want to add about some of the work that you've done putting some of these policies into place or working around some of these vulnerable activities?
Well, a couple of thoughts, Jennifer. One is that I agree that organizations need to customize their approach, and those who have access with vulnerable populations, who have direct contact, may be viewed at a greater risk level. But one of the things we've learned is that simply being a part of an organization, even if they're not dealing directly with vulnerable populations, creates an element of risk. For example, there are those who may not have direct access to children who are volunteers for an organization who use that volunteer status to gain access and break down the inhibitions of other children. Mm-hmm. So I think if you are a volunteer organization in the business of serving a vulnerable population, you need to have a level of concern and a level of detail in your approach to everybody who's going to be a volunteer with your organization, even if you're not giving them direct access to a child as a function of their volunteer role. The second point I would want to make, again, that none of this is a panacea, that none of this is a silver bullet to make the problem go away, is that your organization also needs to have policy, written policy, that provides guidelines on the interactions between your staff and volunteers and the populations they serve, that there be a mechanism in place for monitoring their behavior, for identifying signals and indicators that there might be a problem, for doing what we used to call defensible space, for ensuring that the settings in which your volunteers are interacting with vulnerable populations, there are protections. For example, some organizations, and we urge it, don't allow adult volunteers to be alone with a child in a bathroom area.
Right.
So requirements like having a second adult present or minimizing those risky situations, I think, is important. I also think it's important that there be policy in place regarding how organizations are going to respond to inappropriate behavior or breaches in policy. You need to make it clear in advance that if someone's going to be a volunteer and is going to be working with children or the elderly or some other vulnerable population, if they violate your policies, if they do something to harm someone in that population, you're going to throw the book at them. You're going to use whatever tools and laws and resources are available to hold them accountable for that act. And then the other message that I would send to volunteer organizations is train, train, train. You need to train employees. You need to train volunteers. You need to train caregivers. You need to train youth in terms of what the expectations are. And then you need to practice what you teach to make sure that this is not just a pro forma exercise, but that the people who are representing you, whether as an employee or a volunteer, are implementing your policies or following the policies and are doing what you want them to do.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. We need to have those policies in place, and then we need to talk about them, especially with the things that maybe don't feel so scary, right? So being alone with children, you need to understand that. But when we talk about confidential information, it's not okay to chat about someone's health record in the break room. We have to reinforce and discuss why it's important to keep that information confidential, because it doesn't feel like it's necessarily a bad thing, right? It's not stealing someone's credit card information, but it's still a violation of law and something that we need to talk about with our volunteers as they start to become comfortable or more complacent with doing that work. It's that sort of ever vigilant kind of policy and training and conversation.
And Jennifer, let me add one other point as it relates to criminal and background checks on volunteers is we recognize that organizations will customize what kinds of offenses are exclusionary. From earlier research that I've seen, roughly 1 in 5 organizations will exclude a volunteer for conviction for any crime, only half for a specific crime. So you may want to tailor, I mean, our argument, for example, is that a volunteer for a youth-serving organization or an organization that serves the elderly should be excluded for any conviction involving a crime against a child or a crime against an older person.
Right.
But would a DUI conviction exclude a volunteer if they're not going to be driving the bus or the van that transports? So, I mean, I think there's an element of common sense that needs to be built into the policies that every organization creates.
Absolutely, and I think that certainly at Volunteer Match we get a lot of questions from those volunteers who have maybe made mistakes in the past but have, you know, served their time or, you know, made their crimes, you know, sort of made that up to society, and they want to volunteer and does something like a DUI or, you know, a crime that wasn't violent, sort of eliminate you from that pool, and should it? And I think that every organization needs to talk about that on a regular basis, you know, not just make that decision 10 years ago and move forward with it, particularly if there is something that a volunteer with some experience or some life lessons might be able to share with your clients or with your organization. All right, so we wanted to talk a little bit about who makes those decisions, about what you do for background checks, who's informing that conversation. I think this comes along a pretty good alignment with what we would expect. This is coming from the top of your organization, your board, your executive leaders. If you have an HR department, that's a great place to have these conversations or get these decisions made, particularly as we do think back to that first poll question around excuse me, around do we screen our volunteers in the same way that we screen our paid staff? Maybe some of you are in chapters or affiliates where you have a national office or a headquarters, so these get passed down to you from that top umbrella organization. A lot of times this is a conversation to have with your insurance providers. They're giving you some information, or they're helping decide what kinds of volunteers should be screened or what activities might be problematic. Certainly people don't know as well, not too many. Everybody's come with an informed decision, and then we have quite a few falling into that other category. Mr. Allen, do you want to talk a little bit about maybe talking up in your organization or sharing this information if you aren't that decision maker, about revisiting or bringing your screening practices into better alignment with current best practices?
Well, in my view, Jennifer, is that this all flows from the adoption of policy. And again, I was struck in the SureID survey that nearly half of the organizations that responded to the survey have no policy or procedure in place today. I think that's a prescription for disaster. What that means is if you have a problem, you're winging it. You're figuring it out as you go along, and that increases the likelihood of inconsistency, of treating different people differently. So I think it all begins with policy, and I think policy needs to be adopted by the organization's board. So I think that's where every organization needs to have clear, written policy and guidelines in terms of what it's going to do and how it's going to do it. The enforcement of that, I believe, is the responsibility of the director, the chief executive of the organization. And I think the role of the HR department is key in this, because I think this is an issue that applies both to volunteers and to employees. So obviously there are some special legal sensitivities that have to be considered in dealing with employees. There is no legal or constitutional right to be a volunteer. I know all of us need volunteers. We're desperate for volunteers. But you can't allow that desperation to create a situation in which you are accepting people and hoping that they don't do something wrong.
I agree. I say that all the time, that being a volunteer is not a protected activity, so we want to make sure that we're selecting the right volunteers and maybe even asking questions that we wouldn't necessarily ask of employees, because we do want to make sure we're bringing in that right person. All right. I've got a sticky screen. There we go. We talked about those lower cost options. This is oftentimes the sticking point on how many background checks or criminal checks get done. A good dispersion here. A lot of people not knowing, right, if it's run through your HR department or if it's something that you fill out the form and pass it along. And just almost 16% have volunteers contribute to all or some of the costs for these checks. So that is a policy that can be in place to make it a little bit easier for an organization to screen more volunteers. I personally, in my experience, have had fundraising drives for volunteers to contribute to the background checks of other volunteers. So you have a restricted account, a restricted fund specifically to pay for some of those volunteers who maybe can't afford that cost themselves, particularly when we're starting to get to that $20 to $50. That can be a big chunk of money for a volunteer. So we want to make that as accessible as possible so that hopefully not being able to afford a background check doesn't keep someone from volunteering. Mr. Allen, do you have thoughts about passing those costs along or some of those lower cost options that might be available?
Well, I think they're, first of all, the single most important thing is that organizations do this right. Doing something that is low cost and merely makes you feel good but doesn't really provide the kind of comprehensive protection that you need, you're wasting your money. So I think it's important to do it properly and to take this kind of comprehensive approach. There are some interesting new approaches. Your partner in the survey, SureID, is developing one that they're going to launch later in the year. That part of it entails offsets of cost, ways in which nonprofits in effect can recoup costs through additional elements. Another one is the use of philanthropy. I think philanthropy to pay for these kinds of costs is actually a win-win proposition for a lot of nonprofits. This is not just diverting funds for another purpose, but it enhances the credibility of the organization and I think actually contributes to an organization's ability to generate other revenues. There are new approaches. One of the challenges, frankly, when we tried to do this through the Congressional Background Screening Initiative was the cost of fingerprints. And fingerprints in some states are just outrageously expensive, and the FBI has a cost for reviewing fingerprint cards. So there's some interesting work that's being done in terms of new biometric indicators that potentially can be used at a far lesser cost. So my message is I don't think that volunteer serving organizations should throw up their hands and say this is just too expensive, we can't do it, we're a small organization, we have to have volunteers. I think you should look at the options and I think there are going to be options that enable organizations to take a comprehensive approach to this. Not just do screening, but do a comprehensive volunteer management system that includes screening and identification and credentialing and verification that protects an organization and can be done in a low-cost, affordable way that actually benefits the bottom line of the organization. So hopefully that's the direction in which we're moving in this country.
I hope so too. All right. Vicki, do we have any questions from our audience right now?
We do. You all have sparked quite a few questions. We've got over 45 questions.
Wow. Well, we only have 15 minutes, so maybe we can prioritize those.
Definitely keep writing them in if you've got questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can. Some of you are writing in questions that are really specific to what you're doing, so I'm going to try and pose the ones that are a bit more general, because certainly we don't want to be advising you on your specific policies. But one question that actually came in from a couple of folks was just sort of if there's anything to be thinking about differently for virtual volunteers. So folks who are, they're not coming into your office, and you may never meet them face to face. Is there an added layer that you should be thinking about with the policy and screening, or what's your thinking there?
My answer is absolutely. We recognize in the child protection business, in which I've been engaged for 30 years, the internet and technology generally has not only changed the way children are victimized, but it's made it far more complicated to deal with. So absolutely, we need to recognize those kinds of issues, and I think the same model that I talked about applies here. It's just a little, it's one place removed, and it's why background screening can't be independent of identity confirmation, of validating who it is you're dealing with, because we live in a world in which anybody can be anywhere at any time. So I think it is an evolving area in which the same kinds of techniques have to be applied.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and I would add to that, that's where sort of that double check or buddy system can come into play as well. What you don't want is a virtual volunteer interacting with clients or doing some of that sensitive work without any checks or balances. So making sure that there's another set of eyes, or another volunteer that's duplicating or interacting with that volunteer to make sure that nothing's untoward or falling through the cracks.
Great. Thank you. Another one came in around some of the earlier results and insights we found from the survey. Jennifer, I'm going to pose this one for you. Do you have examples of good ways to check skills of potential volunteers? One of the questions we'd ask is if people do skills checks, and some folks were just curious what that would entail.
So I think when we haven't talked too much today about making sure, we talked about training around policies, but if you have volunteers that are doing things like, driving your van or delivering direct services to clients or providing information, we want to make sure that they are remembering all the things that we taught them in training or we discussed in orientation, and we talked a little bit about that with ongoing conversations about what confidentiality means, so that we're checking in. Are they doing things the way that they're supposed to do them? Do they understand why they're not supposed to be alone in a restroom with a child? Do they understand why, some of these policies are in place, and can they explain why they need to follow those rules? So that we are following up to make sure that our training is doing the things that we need it to do, and that we're having those ongoing conversations or ongoing skills checks. So it may not be something like, we might fall along the lines of sort of an informal conversation. If you just have volunteers get together in a volunteer meeting or even in their group or committee and have them turn to their neighbor and explain what they should do if they think that something is happening along the lines of confidentiality or direct access to clients. What should you do if you think you're in a difficult situation? One of the examples there might be volunteers going into clients' homes to do, sort of direct service, and a client asks them to help you balance a checkbook. What are you supposed to do in that situation? That's not an activity that volunteers should be doing. So how do you respond to that? So that you're just giving them those ongoing tools to know what's right and what to do in that situation.
Great, thank you. Another one that's come in from a couple of folks is, on the topic of making sure that you're doing some of these screenings more than just the first time you meet a potential volunteer. What's the right frequency? or how often should you be thinking about this as you build your policy?
I think it varies based upon the level of service, but certainly my sense would be at least every 2 or 3 years, periodically. I don't know that it has to be done annually, but a lot of the new systems that are being put in place validate and verify this, automatically through the record system, so that something will pop up. But I think the key point here is you shouldn't do it just once and think you're protected. So I think it's going to vary based upon what your volunteers do, what the level of exposure is, what the level of risk based upon the vulnerable population is that they're serving.
Great.
And I would add that that's organic, right? So if you do it every 2 to 3 years and you're finding that things are popping up, maybe that looks like every 18 months for a while, and see how that works out.
Great. Thank you. There's another couple questions with folks who are actually bringing in volunteers who are under 18, and if, sort of what the answer is there. I don't know if either of you have thoughts or ideas. I know it's sort of specific to some.
Well, my thought, obviously, juvenile records are not public and are protected, but this is an area where if you're using younger volunteers, where the screening process, the reference process, and the interview process is so important. I think what you need to do is engage in open-ended interviews, open-ended questions to the prospective volunteer that gets them to talk about themselves and their interest and why they want to volunteer. And in some ways, you need to trust your gut. If there's a sense you get, if there's a discomfort that comes to you from the interview, again, as you pointed out, Jennifer, there is no legal right to be a volunteer. So this is not a protected class. So I think the most important thing with younger volunteers is, one, significant interviewing and screening and reference checks, and then secondly, not putting them into situations in which they're not going to have monitoring and oversight. You need to observe what they do and how they do it and who they do it with.
Absolutely. I would also add that sometimes you just need to be able to check that box off. So even if you're not expecting to get anything back because your volunteer is underage, to be able to say that you've run a background check on all of the volunteers in these positions, it might be sort of a balancing act of not just screening, but also running a check, knowing nothing probably is going to come back, but to be able to say that you've done it, again, to live that policy that this is what we do and this is how we screen our volunteers it's a valid answer.
Great. And then along the same lines of just sort of a different kind of profile of volunteers, what about corporate volunteers? So we know that a lot of companies have their employees participate in an event or project at an organization. Actually a couple organizations are asking if they should all go through background checks.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Jennifer, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a good question, and it's one that I am personally, with my own volunteering activities, living with. And I think it's a hard one to make that case for, because sometimes that expense comes in, and I think a lot of organizations think, well, that company, that corporation screened that employee, that's good enough for us, and that probably isn't the right answer.
I don't think it's the right answer, and I think the important thing is whatever you do to screen volunteers, you develop a uniform, consistent process so that you can say to that corporation, this is something we do for all volunteers. And the reality is it is no more illogical to think that there would be an employee of a corporation who would have a particular deviance or a particular interest. I mean, these are all kinds of people. They do not look like the kinds of people who crawled out from under a bridge. They are doctors and lawyers and business executives and school teachers and bus drivers and police officers. At the National Center, we had a volunteer program that used retired police officers, and we would screen them. So I think what's important is that every organization have policy in place so that you're not put into a situation in which it looks like you don't trust them or you're doing something special for your corporate volunteer.
Right.
But the most important thing is that there be consistent, uniform policy that can be applied regardless of the source of volunteer.
I agree completely. That idea that all volunteers in this capacity or working in this role or interacting with these clients go through this process, whether they're 18, whether they come from a corporation. And again, we don't know necessarily when that corporation ran that check, how long ago it was, or if something came up that was acceptable for the corporation that may not be acceptable for the work that we're asking that volunteer to do. All right, I want to go ahead and just end with a little information. I know this is a sponsored Insight series, so we did launch this survey with SureID, and they have just a little bit of messaging that we want to share with you. The SureID service is a patented 4-step high-assurance identity management solution that helps organizations enroll, identify, and verify who they can trust. It seamlessly and cost-effectively combines identity authentication, initial and ongoing background screening, and credential verification via a mobile app. The SureID service protects the people and reputations of organizations where trust is essential. The SureID service is delivered by EID Passport, a national leader in high-assurance identity management and the leading provider of commercial credentials for the U.S. military. And then we have their contact information available as well. So we want to thank SureID for the funding to run that survey and to share this information with you today. Vicki or Mr. Allen, any last questions or comments here as we get to the top of the hour?
No, all I'd like to say, Jennifer, is I've been honored to be a part of this. I really admire the progress that's being made in the volunteer sector. I know what these organizations are doing. We've come light years in the past decade. My message is we've still got farther to go. And every organization needs to do this, needs to take it seriously, and to recognize that it's the right thing to do. They're protecting not only themselves and their organization, but they're protecting the people they serve. So I hope they'll take those next steps, and we'll make it volunteering a safer practice across America.
Great, thank you. I want to reiterate that as well. Sometimes these can be difficult conversations within your organization, within your existing volunteer corps, with up to leadership, executive directors, or board chairs, but it's really important that we start these conversations or start thinking about the screening that we're doing now and if that's meeting the needs of our volunteers today and, more importantly, our clients and our organizations. All right, just a little pitch for our Learning Center. We have not only our Insight series, but also our Professional Development series. Many of you may be familiar with those. We encourage you to visit and see what's coming up for the next quarter. Vicki, any last words that you want to add?
No, I just, thank you again to Ernie Allen for joining and sharing all of his years of experience and insight into this and sort of helping the nonprofits think through how to really create some smart policies for themselves.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. A special thank you to Mr. Allen, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.